it's a pleasure to introduce Abigail Langton, who's going to give us a couple of perspectives on skin aging.
Okay, so thank you for inviting me this afternoon. So this is a little bit different than you've heard so far. This is some basic science into thinking about how our skin ages. So why is it important to research skin aging? Well, we know that populations around the world are rapidly aging, and it's predicted that between 2015 and 2050, the number of people aged 60 years or older will rise from 900 million to 2 billion. And like every other complex biological system, the skin grows, it matures and ages throughout the life course. And skin aging is associated with a reduction in our functional capacity. We become more susceptible to diseases, skin diseases, cancers. But skin appearance is also a really key observable feature, and we know that has an impact on our emotional and our mental well-being. So when we think about aging, we want our aging to be healthy. And so we have two processes when we think about the skin in its aging process. So we have intrinsic aging. Now this is something that we can really do very little about. This is our chronological aging. It's determined by our genetics. Maybe hormones play a role in it, but really it's just a passage of time. But the extrinsic factors are something that we can do something about. So about 80% of the effects of aging is shown in our face, and that's because of the sun and our exposure to the sun. But things like pollution will have an impact on our skin. Whether we smoke, our healthy lifestyles or not, our diet, how much stress we have, all of these play a role in our extrinsic aging. And when we think about clinically how the skin ages, this photograph really typifies somebody who's been a gardener or a golfer for most of their lives. So above the collar line, we can see the effects of the sun on the skin, and this is what we call photoaging. Below the collar line, where the skin has been largely protected from the sun, we can see the effects of intrinsic aging. And you can see that actually that skin looks very healthy. It's only got fine wrinkles on it. The texture is smooth and the complexion is even. The pigmentation on this part is fairly even as well. And we see that in this area, we'd only have a gradual loss of elasticity in the skin. And by elasticity, I mean that pinch test. So if you take the back of your hand and you pinch it, rapidly lifts and is elastic, and then it returns to its normal position. And that process that we can retain is healthy for our skin. Above the collar line, we see the effects of the sun. And you can see that there's deep, coarse wrinkles. There's a roughened texture. The pigmentation becomes sallow and mottled, and we get a marked loss of elasticity and recoil. And this functional capacity is really important to the research I do. So the reason why we know that this is important is because when we take skin biopsies, which is really what my research does, we take healthy people and we look at their skin below the surface. And histologically, we can see lots of changes that happen to our skin as a result of the sun. So this picture here will show you, in the blue, this is our epidermis, so that's our interface with the outside world. And deeper down, we've got the dermis. And these green fibres in the skin are called elastin. And these are the things that make our skin elastic. It's like a rubber band within our skin. It helps us recoil and stretch. And you can see in young skin, this is healthy skin, that green staining is in nice arrangement. It's got what we call candelabra-like arrangement. And it's joining the epidermis and the dermis together. But when we have the effects of the sun on the skin, you can see that that green staining disappears in terms of its arrangement, but it becomes an amorphous mass in the skin. And it no longer behaves like that elastic band. So that skin would have lots of unfortunate you would stretch the skin and it would struggle to return back to its original position. The other thing that goes hand in hand with elastin is something called fibrillin. And again, this is like a tent peg in the skin. It holds that epidermis in place, and when you lift the epidermis, it means that the skin snaps back into position. And the effects of the sun on that area, just below the epidermis, is we end up with truncated fibrillin. And again, our skin cannot recoil back to its original position because we get the loss of these tent pegs holding the skin together. So my research has been particularly interested in understanding what our skin looks like regardless of our skin colour. And dermatology research has historically been disproportionately focused on white Northern European skin. As a result, our knowledge gap is great in terms of our biology of people with different skin. So the first question I asked was, is skin fundamentally the same? We know it has the same function. It's there to protect us from the environment. It's to stop water escaping. It's to stop nasties coming into the skin. But do we do it in the same way, regardless of our ethnicity? And the answer is, well, we kind of had the same structure, we kind of had the same composition, but it's not quite the same. And so this study was conducted here in Manchester using volunteers from Salford Royal Hospital, and we looked at students' skin. So we had cohorts of African students and cohorts of Northern European students. And you can see here in these images, in the black skin, we've got this beautiful brown stain. Oh, go back. We've got this beautiful brown staining, and this is the melanin in the skin. So this is what's going to protect our skin from the sun. And you can see that actually what we were finding in the skin was that African skin was slightly thicker than white Northern European skin, and it had more of these convolutions. And this is these parts here. And what that means is the skin was anchored together slightly better than in white skin. But actually the skin was pretty much the same. What we did find that was different was the amount of elastin we had and the amount of fibrillin. So whilst we think African skin would tend to be slightly healthier as it ages because of the protective effects of melanin, we actually see that they have less elastin in their skin and white skin has slightly more elastin. But the fibrillin, which is its partner, was actually more abundant in black skin than white skin. But all these skin types were perfectly healthy. This was in photoprotected, so sun-exposed buttock. So what impact do these differences in kind of the composition of the skin have on skin function? So this we can do non-invasively. So this is not about taking biopsies. This is looking at the skin using a device called a cutometer. And if we apply this to the skin, it creates a vacuum and it sucks the skin up into it. And we call this deformation. So here you'll see the skin is rapidly sucked into the chamber, and then if we remove the vacuum, the skin returns to its original position. And if we repeat this process in 10 cycles, we can start to see if the skin starts to tire. We can also start to measure different things. So there's things like elasticity. There's things like hysteresis, which is the tiring of the skin, and the fatigue. So in the same cohorts of individuals, so our young African skin, we looked in their buttock. And we can see that actually the skin is rapidly deformed into this chamber by about 1 millimetre, and then it returns almost to its original position. And the same was almost true for the white Northern European skin. We saw no significant difference in this young skin. And as we did before, we looked at their skin biopsies and we could see that all the skin was happy. It was in those same proportions where the black skin had a little bit more fibrillin than elastin, but everything was healthy and happy. What we did see, though, is that in the forearm, we were looking at slightly different deformation curves just because the thickness of the skin is different. But black skin, again, behaved really well. There was no tiring over those 10 cycles. But in what we thought was a largely healthy white population, people who were aged 18 to 25, we could start to see that in their forearm skin, we had a decline in their function. So the skin wasn't able to be stretched as much, and it couldn't return to its normal position again after these 10 cycles. These individuals showed no signs of clinical aging. They were 18 to 25 years, but their skin had started to be damaged by the sun. So we could see now that we were seeing differences in the function of the skin. And actually we could see histologically in those skin biopsies there was now a difference. So our African skin was happy, the elastin was in the normal position, fibrillin was in the normal position, but the elastin in the white skin was starting to become amorphous. It was truncated at the epidermis. It wasn't forming those connections, and even the fibrillin there was starting to be damaged. We're no longer seeing those connections, and this was having an impact on the structure and the function now of the skin. And when we looked at this as a collective, we can see that we had a group where we had young African buttock, young African forearm, and young white buttock that grouped together where everything was happy and healthy, and we were now seeing a difference in the Northern European forearm. Clinically it looked healthy, functionally and histologically there was showing a decline even at 25 years old. So that's in young skin. What about in aged skin? Well, again, as I said, disproportionately all the research happens in white skin. And that's probably because it's so much more noticeable, the effects of aging and indeed UV-induced sun damage on white skin. So we decided to do a similar study, but this time using a collaboration we had at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore in the States. So the population there is largely black, and they were very willing to take part in these studies. So again, we did non-invasive testing and then took biopsies and looked at the function of the skin. So this is comparing now black buttock skin and black from young people and from old people. And by old, we mean over 70 years old. So the functional capacity of the young buttock skin, perfectly healthy and happy. It was returning back to its normal position, nice and elastic. And actually, largely we could see that in the intrinsically aged, so this was the buttock skin of our older individuals, again, the skin was pretty happy and healthy. What we did start to see is that there was fatigue setting in. So over these 10 cycles, you can see the red line is starting to increase. We can see that it's tiring as we do these repetitive cycles, but it's pretty healthy. When we looked at the forearm, we can see again our black skin, young, healthy, happy at those photo-exposed sites. But this time we could see that there was an effect here in the aged skin. We could see that now we had less elasticity, there was tiring of the system. It certainly wasn't returning back to its original position. But in all, to look at it, it looked fairly healthy. When we look below the surface of the skin, this is our normal situation in young black skin. We've got the buttock and the forearm, lots of interdigitations in that epidermis, lots of mechanical strength. But when we saw the old intrinsically aged buttock, we could see that those interdigitations were now reduced. That mechanical strength between the epidermis and the dermis was starting to be diminished. And actually in the forearm skin, we can see it was virtually flattened. So you can imagine now how shear stress, tears in the skin start to happen as you get older, because we've got this flattening of the epidermis. The elastin situation, as we saw before, beautifully arranged, nice and abundant in young skin. We don't see a difference in abundance in the intrinsically aged skin, but it's starting to change how it's organised. You can see it's not kind of sitting between the epidermis and the dermis, pulling that connection together. And certainly by the time we get to the forearm, which was being chronically aged, that elastin is starting to be truncated. You can see how it wouldn't be able to stretch like your rubber band. But we don't see that amorphous mass that we were seeing in white skin. Solar elastosis isn't there. It's pretty much truncated and sparse in black skin. And then the same with fibrillin. We're seeing that in our young situation, we've got lots of nice arrangements of fibrillin. We're seeing truncation of that in our old intrinsically aged buttock. And we're seeing a diminishment of this staining again in the forearm. So there's certainly something happening histologically. There's something that's happening functionally in the black aged skin. So we can see that intrinsically aged skin is less resilient, it's less elastic than young skin, and it's characterised by loss of the retiridges, this loss of connectivity between the epidermis and the dermis caused by fibrillin-rich microfibrils. And then we also see in the forearm, we've got complete flattening of the epidermis and the depletion of elastic fibre abundance and organisation. And when we plot these factors again, you can see that one portion sticks out here. We've got the region where we've flattened our epidermis. We've lost those connectivity between the fibrillin-rich microfibrils, and we've lost biomechanical function. And what you might be able to recognise here is what I showed you a little bit earlier, that we've got a situation similar to that we saw in the white skin. The only difference here is about a 40 to 50 year age gap. So our white individuals will be showing this kind of functional decline by about 25 years old, and our black individuals here are more like 70 to 75 years old. So just to conclude, we can see that in skin of colour, despite the photoprotective properties of melanin, we do still see the effects of sun exposure on the skin, and that affects both the histology and the functional role of the skin. Skin ageing, though, at sun-exposed sites proceeds at a slower rate in black skin than white skin. However, we would still say it's important to think about using multimodal photoprotection for all, regardless of skin type. It doesn't have to be always a high SPF, but you ought to think about wearing a hat, wearing protective clothing. Just like to finish by thanking all the volunteers, our collaborators at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. Thank you.
It's very interesting. It's very much to go from stories and to biology, and it just shows the breadth. Do you think you would ever get the situation where you're using one of the cutometer,
Yep.
someone, say, in a GP practice, we were talking about GPs earlier, could get a sort of skin test to say, oh, you're at risk, beware, or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really simple device, it's very effective, and it really mirrors what you've got going below the surface without having to take those biopsies. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very much, Abigail. Thank you very much indeed.